This is the audio recording for Matt Tinkler's Anthology 2023, recorded and narrated by Matthew Tinkler. Page 5. The Bells of Agatha. Many years ago, there was a humble town, once called Agatha. But this story is not about the fate of the town, or the history on how it came to be. Instead, it is a story of the people, the hard-working people, and the harsh winters that used to fall down onto the narrow streets. And with every Christmas came tradition, heartwarming fires, kindness, and the iconic, mysterious, and summoning phenomenon which were to be called the Bells of Agatha. The December wind cut through the streets of Agatha like it had done every year. Snowdrifts piled in the streets and on rooftops, being sculpted into an alien form by the harsh wind and violent winter storms. Each house in the town was made from ancient stone, collected by past generations. The wooden roofs of these houses creaked and cracked as inside gentle fires in iron stoves wailed to warm the occupants. A hollow sound echoed through the early morning. And again. A single large bell chimed from a lonely church in the centre of town. It chimed in the early morning every day of December. Today was December 24th, Christmas Eve. The sun was just rising from the hills, softly touching the blanket of snow that covered the town and surrounding fields as two teenage boys marched through the gentle snowfall. These boys wore scarves, hats, heavy hiking boots, thick patched winter coats, and thick winter trousers. Their clothing was old, passed down from generations before, being repaired and maintained to carry on being useful for the next generation. The two boys stopped their march on Main Street, just outside the abandoned church. They looked up to the steeple of the church, where they could roughly see the single bell in the low light. The bell swung freely in the wind, looking over the main street through the town. One of the boys, Jake, spoke to his friend playfully, pushing him to the church guttering that ran up the side of the entrance to the roof. "Go on then! You're the one who hates that bell ringing every year." The other teen, Mike, replied while correcting his winter hat. "I will. Chill out." Jake raised his hands next to him in surrender. "I am chill. It's freezing out here. Just hurry up before anyone catches us." Mike huffed and slowly began to climb the iron guttering, abseiling upward, using his feet against the stonework. He could feel his hands slip on the iron, his gloves having no grip on the black surface. He slipped off, and with instinct of falling, he grasped the gutter and pulled himself close. Jake laughed to his friend. "Almost there!" Mike made it up to the church tower, rolling into the snow on the slanted roof. He breathed for a moment, and then pulled a penknife from his coat pocket. By now the sun was blessing the snow-covered town, and the fields around it with a haze of gold. The rays of the sun cut through the clouds, and where the beams contacted the snow, white clouds slowly rose into the atmosphere. The steam, melting from the ice, created a faint fog, growing in size and staying low for miles around. The bell was placed inside a tower. Its wooden arches that surrounded it, and the designs on the walls were carved by hand, depicting stories of legends, religions, and some basic history for the town. Mike looked to the bell. Its etching and brass Celtic collar around its base were corroded away from centuries of battles with the elements. He looked to the thick rope that was connected to a long arm above it. He was anxious and jumped in surprise as someone below closed their front door, and with haste he sawed the rope with his knife, eventually throwing the severed piece of rope onto the snowy floor. He looked at the bell again. He was sure no one would notice anyway. It must be electronically controlled, as the constant ringing in the morning is at an hour when no one would want to be awake. It would wake him up every night, far too early. Every day on this season of goodwill, and now the silent night, with an act of goodwill for himself, will truly be silent, peaceful. Mike turned away and began to walk on the roof of the church, the gutter, when a sound of cracking met his ears. He slowly looked back to the bell. and as he caught sight of the bell hanging inside its house, a fragment cracked and fell from the bottom, clunking the wooden floor below it. Mike sighed in relief and continued to slide down the gutter. Mike slid down the drain pipe as his friend Jake greeted him. Jake was curious, walking with his friend. "Did you kill the beast?" Mike chuckled as he pretended to duel in the air, pretending to duel his friend on the walk back. "The feral swine had no chance against me, and the terror of the early morning wake-up call was no more." Jake dueled back, and the two clashed arms as two swordsmen would. Jake stated, "The bell shall have its revenge. The great bing-bang-bonger will reawaken." The two laughed, released their clash, and continued walking as Jake smiled. Very poetic. Anyway, I better get back. My parents are expecting me. It is Christmas Eve after all. There's lots to prepare. The two continued on their journey and split ways at their usual meeting point, the crossroads. That evening, Mike visited his grandmother, Agatha. She was slightly hunched and wore a blanket round her waist to keep her legs warm. Her house was untouched by the change of time outside the walls, her now ancient wallpaper and decorations collecting dust, as well as a single photo of Mike's granddad. Mike stared at the classic ornaments and sighed. His family had gone home for the night, but he wanted to stay until morning to give Agatha some company. "I miss Grandad, Nan." Agatha shuffled over next to him, looking to the picture of his granddad, which they both admired. She spoke with a sweetly aged voice. "You know, he is closer to us than you think." Mike turned to look at his grandmother, who stood 2 feet shorter than him. "How do you know?" Agatha smiled, her false teeth showing briefly. "Christmas is a special time for everyone to get together. Family and friends unite to celebrate peace on earth, and it all starts with the chime of that bell in that church." Mike stiffened in guilt and replied, choking on his words, "The bell? It chimes every night early in the morning. I find it." Agatha intercepted, speaking slowly. "That bell brings back such good memories of your granddad and me. And on this night I stand in the entrance of this house, looking out from the doorway, and when the bell chimes, I see him. I remember he still loves me. He still loves you. He still loves us all." Mike's guilt increased as Agatha stared at the photo, smiling. He had severed the bell as it aggravated him, but he never stopped to think of anyone else. The purpose of the bell, the legend of it, what it meant to everyone in the town. If it didn't ring, his Nan would be heartbroken. Mike took it as a responsibility to make sure that he was happy over Christmas. And for once, he felt that it was his duty to make others happy too. "I have to go, Nan." He kissed his grandmother on the cheek as he quickly made his way to the door. Agatha stood in the house. She smiled and looked to a ticking clock on the mantel. The time was 12, midnight. Mike grabbed the roll of duct tape his granddad kept on the sideboard in the hallway and closed the front door. Outside he waded through the snow. The drifts were deep, and every step he felt like a giant crashing leg for a hill. Agatha's house was a short journey from the church, and once close enough, he looked up to the steeple above. Mike shook his hands, trying to warm them before his long climb upward. Eventually, he began to climb, slowly shimming up the outside of the drainpipe. Wind howled up on the roof, and the lifeless bell swung freely, but did not ring. Thick snow on the flat rooftop slowed his steps, and he shielded his eyes from the frosty breeze, trying to spy the rest of the rope cut from the bell. The time rolled on, dragging closer and closer to the time the bell sings its song. Eventually Mike swiped the snow from the rope and tied the 2 pieces of rope together. He checked his watch, 12:59. Sitting back, he looked to the bell. Mike held his breath. His watch switched to 1 p.m. 1. Nothing. He looked around, slightly panicked. He began to think as the blizzard hammered against his clothing. When he realized, the chip! He grabbed a metallic lump that stuck out the snow, grabbed the tape from his pocket, and squeezed the chip in place as he began to tape around the large bell over and over. A thick layer of tape laid over the bell's patterns, and he sat back once again, breathing heavily, and the only sound in his ears was the howl and whine of the wind. The bell erupted into action, vibrating Mike's bones. After the third chime, a steady tap-tap of a marching snare drum began to echo through the streets. Then trumpets bellowed their triumphant chorus, and heavy clap of footsteps followed. Mike screwed up his face in confusion. Turning around from the bell, he clambered, climbing on ice, heading to the roof edge where the sounds came from. And he opened his mouth in astonishment. The view from the bell tower revealed Agatha, his nan, standing at her doorstep, watching a parade of pale figures appear from the mist and march through the street. She stood out in the cold, silently watching as the snow battered her clothing. The apparitions wore military clothing, civilian clothing, and also contained the injured rolling in wheelchairs, hobbling on crutches, or being carried by their fellow pale figures. Ghosts? A ghost parade? The ghost parade was made up of honourable, friendly, and influencing individuals. Individuals who embodied the meaning of Christmas. They marched through the main street every year, being summoned by the bell, given the chance to greet their past loved ones again. A tradition long forgotten and now remembered by no one in the town, lost to time by generations of non-believers and drunken celebrations, being only witnessed by those who can pride themselves on their busy schedules and listen to the call of the bell. Agatha stood watching when a familiar-looking ghost walked out of the blizzard's parade to greet her. He was old. Older than Agatha, in fact. "Grandad?" Mike spoke to himself in surprise as the drums began to fade. The trumpets boomed away, and the last of the parade marched into the blizzard at the end of the street. Agatha and Grandad held each other as slowly Grandad faded away, and Agatha stood holding herself. She softly said goodbye, stepped inside from the cold, and closed the door. Mike still laid in the snow on the roof of the church, now partially buried, as he stared in astonishment to the now empty street. Mike's selfless act of kindness had saved the tradition. He learned a lesson that day, that if he listens to other people's interests, he will realise that his own views that annoy him and his actions were maybe too harsh. That a little compassion can make someone's day, a little understanding can change your perspective, and happiness can be spread by a small act of courage. Mike turned and laid down. He looked to the blizzard above, whispering to himself. The bell rang for a reason. It wasn't neglected. It was needed by the town. By Nan. Merry Christmas, Nan. He warmly smiled. The following year, Agatha peacefully passed away, reuniting with her husband, but Mike never grieved, as he would see her again, every year. He waited for the bell to chime and watched over it, not only for him, but for everyone who believed. And so the legend of the Bell of Agatha continued through Mike's children and through the following generations. And if you listen close enough on Christmas morn, at 1 p.m, you can hear the drums and the trumpets sound as your loved ones, your fallen heroes, and those who had never given up, march in hopes they see you again. The end.